Today on Your Daily Detroit, we're talking about not just the State of the City speech by Detroit Mayor Mike Duggan, but we're discussing some of the key topics inside of it, impacting Detroiters' everyday lives. To do that, with me, Chase Cantrell. He's a developer and heads up Building Community Value. That's a nonprofit dedicated to helping projects in Detroit's neighborhoods happen. I'm Jer Stays, and since we have such a big show for this Thursday, March 10th, 2022, let's just get into it. Joining me in the North End studio, friend of the show, Chase Cantrell. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great. It's good to be back.
It's good to see you. And you know what? Let's just start from the very beginning here. You got shouted out last night.
Yes. So my phone absolutely blew up when that happened, and including my parents calling and saying that they're very proud. So it was unexpected, but I think we'll probably get into the way in which you talked about development in Detroit. But yeah, it was an interesting moment.
Well, that's one of his trademarks, right? Like there's a metal album, The Master of Puppets, and I like to call Mike Duggan the Master of PowerPoints.
That's a really good title.
Because he gets up there and he loves a good PowerPoint, like a good corporate road warrior.
He does indeed.
To me, the whole thing really sounded like a type of victory lap.
It absolutely did. And every State of the City address, I mean, this was his 9th. Every single one builds upon the last one, right? And this one certainly was the most celebratory that I've ever heard. There's no denying that there are good things that are happening in the city of Detroit. And he wants to, especially the larger symbols of any sort of progress, the Michigan Central stations of the city. he wants to point to those as true victory. So he was able to very methodically with his PowerPoints, right? Very methodically go through all of the prior symbols of decay in the city and say, look, there has been progress. Either these things have been renovated already or in the process of being renovated. And I think that as a resident, there is some pride in that. And those are things that he should point out and that should be celebrated. But any State of the City is also a practice of, all of the things that you point to, but there's always so many things that don't get talked about.
Well, I mean, that's with any elected official, right? They're gonna kind of feather their own nest a little bit.
Exactly. For those who saw the State of the Union address by Biden a few weeks ago, same thing, right?
Yeah.
You're only going to point to the things that are positive.
But it does create a good template to talk about what's happening in the city. And he did touch on a lot of important things. And let's kind of go down the line. Let's talk about development first, that big ticket development. Look, I remember when I worked for the Detroit Regional News Hub, those eyesores, like his whole thing of international exhibitions of ruin porn is 100% correct. That was like a real thing. Oh,
absolutely. And I mean, so 2013, 2014, I lived abroad. I lived in Europe for a year. And when I said I was from Detroit, people either talked about violence or people talked about ruin porn. It was one of the two. It was very disconcerting, and I always had to provide real context for people about what was happening in the city. So it was palpable. So, he was absolutely right. That's what people were talking about. People were visiting the city, as he said, wanting to go through vacant buildings. I met a lot of now friends from Europe who visited Detroit, for that purpose. They really wanted to see and they wanted to understand as well once they got here. How did this happen to the shining city on the hill that Detroit once was?
I remember talking to a series of European reporters who thought we had flooded the lodge and turned it into like a space for canoeing. Like they had literally gotten this idea in their head. And I just started singing Alouette on the phone. But that leads to one of the criticisms of the mayor is that some people think that it's this same thing of like neighborhoods, downtown, that sort of thing. I don't know if I'm really into the neighborhoods versus downtown, but I'm more of we need to focus on multiple areas of the city. And I understand why a lot of people look at those bigger projects, but I think it's important to look at the smaller things. And also the other side of that, though, is that it's more complex to do. It's very complex for smaller projects, and it's more difficult sometimes to attract financing. It's sometimes
absolutely
more difficult to get resources together. And, he paraded out a lot of Black developments, and that does need to be talked about and celebrated. On the other hand, the truth is it's still hard out there.
It is very hard. And what I point out to people often is that even the development projects in, Midtown, downtown, now moving further and further north, those are still very challenging projects, right? The market value in the city is not here such that you can get financing easily. You need governmental subsidy in almost all of these deals. whether it's, municipal subsidy or federal subsidy. But, he talked about affordable housing a lot. You don't get affordable housing in the city without federal subsidy, So if it's difficult downtown and midtown, it's exceptionally difficult in the neighborhoods. And oftentimes, as a black developer, oftentimes we get, in fact, steered to do development work in neighborhoods, which are the hardest development projects to do, that requires some of the deepest subsidy and, some of the deepest creativity to make these things work. So, is it really building wealth? I mean, he leaned into this, right? Building wealth for Black entrepreneurs and developers. But oftentimes we ask ourselves, are we actually building wealth for ourselves? Because again, the margins are very small on these deals. I am glad, again, that we are talking about Black development. I think it's actually absolutely important in an 80% African-American city to do that. But at the same time, it's questioning what challenges remain, what barriers remain. Where do Black developers get to do development?
Because you use the word steered, and I want to talk about that for a second.
Sure.
Is that the case where they're saying, hey, you need to go out here or over here? Like, what do you mean by steered?
So the city of Detroit has 10 strategic neighborhoods, right? So in thinking through how the city plans, there are these nodes where more subsidy and more focus goes from the actual municipality. There's also financing that comes along with that. And oftentimes, there is a concerted effort, and I think this is a good thing. There's a concerted effort to get more Black developers on deals. Like, that is a priority of the city of Detroit. That is a priority of lenders in the city. And I think that's a wonderful thing that should be celebrated. But at the same time, oftentimes we're not thought of when we're looking at properties in downtown and midtown, right? There are some, I call them elders, those who have been at this for decades and are in their 50s and 60s above now, they are beginning to be able to do some of those larger deals. But if you are a younger developer in your 30s and 40s, oftentimes there are requests for proposals, RFPs, in the neighborhoods, and lenders and the government are letting Black developers know about these opportunities. So, I won't say steering in the sense of, absolutely these are the only options available for Black developers, but when these opportunities arise, we are definitely leaning into the Black development pool to say we need Black developers to respond to these particular RFPs. And we do. The way that I got a shout out. The way that I was able to get the building that I'm finishing up now was through an RFP process. And there were quite a few Black developers that responded to that RFP. And I'm, buying another building, pretty soon, and similar process. There was an RFP process and there were a lot of Black developers that responded. So in the neighborhoods, that certainly happens, but these are often the most challenging projects to do.
What could fundamentally change to make these projects more profitable and more realistically profitable? Because when we say profit, profit isn't a bad thing. It's what helps all these things go forward. And isn't part of equity having the opportunity to make the same amount of money as someone else would, in another area, right?
Right. And part of it is systems. So in thinking of where value happens in any city, right? Like, oftentimes you see the highest market values in your downtowns. Or the neighborhoods adjacent to a downtown. So that is not unique to Detroit. So part of it will be a natural evolution. As we bring our corridors back, we will see higher market values and greater profit margins for developers. But, the first entrance into that system, most of our corridors need a lot of work. So if you're that first developer in, which is what the Strategic Neighborhood Fund really does, you hopefully will make some money, but it's going to be a slim margin. And it's just part of this is just, it's going to take time to get the market values there.
What would be a couple of the key things that would really help you and people like you doing your work move forward?
Access to pre-development capital. So now we're going to get really nerdy. So
let's do it.
When you are looking at a new building, right? So you're interested in purchasing and in rehabbing. You need money for the survey, for environmental, for the down payment, for all of the due diligence that you need to do up front. And oftentimes for Black developers who don't have deep pockets themselves, that's a process, and that is harder to get through, right? So that's one. So easy access to pre-development capital. And, one of the things that Black developers, large and small. So, I talk to the small scale, I teach and talk to the small scale developers who are doing single family rehabs or duplexes. And I also talk to folks who are building, 200-unit apartment buildings. And it doesn't matter. What we're seeing in the ecosystem is often different terms for Black developers and white developers. And by different terms, I mean, do you need to bring a personal guarantee to the table? Meaning that, if something goes wrong with a deal, they can go after your personal assets. Black developers often get asked to do that. What are the balance sheet requirements? So again, most of us don't have deep balance sheets because we don't come from generations of developers, right? Like most Black developers are entering the system for the first time, but lenders require those balance sheets or working with a white developer to secure that.
And to be clear, many of the developments you see downtown, they might be the kids or grandkids of people who have been doing development in the city for generations.
That's exactly right.
If you dig past a last name or even a current last name, or you look at who's married to whom, you'll see that it's all interconnected. And even, and although it's a Black developer, even when you talk about Richard Hosey and the project with Fisher Body 21, he's been around a minute.
So Richard is my hero in a lot of ways. So when I was working at a law firm downtown, Richard was at Bank of America. So, I was at a firm that represented the developer very often, and he was the loan officer on a lot of these deals. So I remember just starry-eyed, thinking of Richard like, oh my God, here's this really exceptionally brilliant, Black lender who's making all these large deals happen. I think I met him first on Broderick Tower. That was like 2010, 2011. And since then, to see him go from Bank of America to start his own development firm, he's one of those guys. He's been around long enough that he knows where all the bodies are buried. So, he was the one creating all of these really creative structures to make these deals work in the first place. So now that he's on the developer side, he's able to use all of that talent and high brain power to be able to make these complex transactions happen. And I look at him as a shining example of what I myself can become.
But in the downtown market, he is the exception, not the rule.
He is the exception, not the rule. But I also think that Richard works very hard, and not just Richard, other elders in the ecosystem work very hard to blaze paths, such that in not even in the future, right? I think that there are more doors that are opening for someone like me as well because Richard kicked the door down. So when I first started this work, I remember asking. This is a very male dominated field. So,
you don't say.
Right. and even the image that Duggan showed yesterday, like I have to look back. I don't know if Sonia was the only woman there, Sonia Mays, but there were very few women in the graphic. And I remember asking older Black men who do this work, I'm just like, where have you been? Because I haven't been able to see them doing the work that they do such that I could know that I could do it. And I think we've built new ecosystems now such that we see the Greg Jacksons and we see the Richard Hoseys and we know the work that they're doing. And that inspires a whole new generation to say, oh, we actually can do this work too.
Would you like to see more access to signature projects like, say, the mayor spent a ton of time on the Packard plant? Do you think that there's a lot of opportunity at a place like that?
I think that there is. And in fact, what I knew some of the background about the Packard plant, but he actually talked about how many buildings there are on that parcel, right? There's so many opportunities to really divide that up and to do a lot of smaller, innovative things. And not just the mayor, but if city staff wanted to be very creative and wanted to uplift black talent in the city, we really could subdivide parcels like that and allow burgeoning developers to do more.
And it's a huge parcel. I remember when I covered the drainage issues and everything, when people started to wake up that, in fact, Palazuelo just had not been keeping up on bills.
Yes. Did you notice he refused to say his name?
I saw that.
Yes.
It was like Voldemort. But I remember because I was out there and I saw when that bridge came down and I saw that, a lot of the TV stations were running a loop footage of the bridge down. I'm like, why did that bridge fall down? That bridge over East Grand Boulevard. And that's when I started digging and foying Freedom of Information Act, looking at, water bills, drainage bills, and realizing that he had gotten himself stuck into a mountain of bills.
Yeah. There are 47 separate buildings over there.
It's insane.
It's insane. So, again, opportunity rather than deficit. There's certainly an opportunity there to do something really creative. And, the city should put its money where their mouths are, right? So if we're really going to celebrate Black development, there's an opportunity in something like that and so many other parcels around the city to do really creative things.
I know that my listeners would be upset at me if I didn't talk about transit, at least for a little bit. He kind of spun through it quickly in the state of the city, much less than some other years, having watched these now since, probably 20 years of these things that I've seen. He talked about new buses. After doing a little bit of research, that's about the amount you need to replace every year for normal wear and tear. That's one of the challenges about having a bus fleet instead of train stock is that, in places like Chicago, whatever, you can refurbish and keep train stock running. There's stuff in Chicago running right now still from the 80s.
Wow.
Whereas a bus, every 12 years, you're up for federal grant money to get a new bus. And so there's 280, 300. The numbers are kind of wishy-washy, but that's the kind of amount of buses we think are in the DDOT fleet. And so that's about a 10% turnover. So this is just trying to keep things at stasis. And that's even with the number of bus drivers he wants to hire. That would keep things. Thank you to listener Ted for sharing some screenshots from some public DDOT presentations that he went to. I love how nerdy our listeners are to go to these things because I am but one person and each of us have little things. So I appreciate all the tips that people send me. So this plan is really to try to get things to pre-pandemic levels stasis. But I do have concerns of how we're going to get there because in the most recent budget, he talked about drivers and, they did get a pay raise, but they're starting at $15 an hour. And in this, economy right now, I just did a quick spin through Indeed. Most jobs are like that are starting at 20. And if you want to become a commercial driver, you can make $70,000, $80,000 a year.
That's right.
So I don't know between the drivers and the mechanics and everyone he wants to hire, I don't know how he gets from here to there.
Very, very true. And I mean, this has been an issue for years. And even he referenced this fact. He's like, we're not happy. We're nowhere near happy with the service that we're giving to citizens of Detroit. His own words. And maybe this was one of the few moments where he acknowledged something negative.
Well,
right?
You can't deny it.
You can't deny it. And they've had trouble hiring all kinds of staff in the past as well. So you're exactly on point that, it doesn't seem like there's a new solution for getting from here to there, as you said.
Because this issue is not just in Detroit. This is so many of these issues. Detroit is not a unique snowflake.
That's right.
These issues are in cities across the country. And I don't know if we're going to see a breakthrough on this until we start to see things like, I've seen things from the automakers around autonomous buses and things like that, shuttles. And that's one area where autonomous might actually work, where you have a fixed route. You know what lanes you're going to be going into. Like, that's something where that could begin to work. I don't know. Unless we get some magic influx of people, we, increase immigrate, we do something. I don't know what. I think this is a problem we're going to be dealing with long term.
I think so too. And what's interesting about, the question of people, I don't know if you caught it, but he said that population was increasing in Detroit. It was very, very,
He's still holding on to that.
He's still holding on to that when everything seems to show that it's not.
Just in this morning, I read it. The Census Bureau says that they undercounted Black populations by about 3% and Hispanic by about 5%, but that still would get him nowhere near his dream number of 700,000.
That's right.
And I can fully admit, and I've talked about this on the show before, I can fully admit a here and there of 10,000, something like that. I can fully see that being the case. But I understand that there is this hope that a lot of people have that there are magically another 60, 70,000 people in the city. I'm sorry.
I just don't think it's that.
Let's face facts. Let's face reality. And it's much better to govern in reality than to run around and trying to say that, you've done something you haven't.
Well, here's a tip for future politicians, right? Like he said early on to evaluate his ability to govern on whether you can get more population in the city.
He dug this ditch himself.
He's dug it himself. And I mean, I think that's part of why, he's holding on to that narrative.
Let it go, Mike. It's okay. We understand. We didn't expect you to get that anyway.
Right.
Let's change gears. Let's talk about blight removal, something that has been, honestly, a focus of State of the City's press conferences for years.
Well, the interesting thing about blight and blight removal, so demolition, in the city is that the more vacant land you have, it's not as though, and I think this is a misperception among some people that, if you have vacant land, this is going to benefit developers.
Interesting.
But the more vacant land you have, it actually drives market value down. It becomes more difficult to build. Because what a lender is looking at, what else is in the neighborhood? Like, what values can you get from rent or, residential or commercial rent in the neighborhood? And if there's nothing else really to compare it to, that drives market value. So the more vacancy you have, the harder it is.
I was talking on background with a realtor who told me that your actual cost, if you wanted to build a house from scratch, is going to run you about $500,000 in the city. Like if you see one of those empty lots and you want to build a single family house on it, they're like, it's going to be $400,000 to $500,000. And that's why you don't see any people like, because what I asked was, why is it that there are so many lots? Like there are lots from near the studio. I could pick it up for 20 grand. To me, it boggles my mind why a person just like, there are people with this kind of money.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it's a lot of money, but it's not a lot of money, right? Like it is, but it isn't. Like it boggles my mind that there aren't people who pick up that piece of land and say, why don't I just build a house here? Like it drives, I don't understand. Like I'm simple. I'm not a development expert. You are. Like I don't. So I asked, a few realtors on background. They're like, the costs of doing this and how the city is set up to do this it's just not set up to do this. It's just something they're not used to seeing.
It's something that the city is not used to seeing. Construction costs, per square foot is extremely high right now in residential. However, there are some local developers, and one who I will name is Jason Jones at Tecton Development, who's actually found a way to keep those construction costs pretty low.
Really?
And part of it is, what construction talent you're using. And there are ways to cost control. And I mean, but if you are hiring a normal residential general contractor, your costs are going to be fairly high. And you're right. Like if you're at 250 or 300 per square foot, like it costs a lot to build new in the city. Can we find ways to get those costs down? Absolutely. And I think that, there are some smaller moves that are happening in the city of how do we get more people trained in construction trades? How do we build an ecosystem that we've lost to drive some of that cost down? But we just don't build new in the city of Detroit. We haven't in a very long time. And I also think of it in terms of it's very abnormal to see in the suburbs and exurbs of any major metropolitan area that the new construction is only happening on the outskirts, right? And I think it's slowed down in the past few years, but typically for the past couple of decades, it's been like 10,000 new units per year, but not in the city of Detroit, not in the core.
And not even in the inner suburbs. Like
not even in the
once in a while, you'll see like a Bigfoot house transition in Royal Oak where you have to see a smaller house torn down and a much bigger house built on the lot. You'll see some of those, but not much other than that.
That's exactly right. Yeah, part of it is construction costs. Part of it is just how we think of the movement of people in our region as well. And Detroit is becoming more popular. Like more people from the suburbs are interested in living in Detroit, although I don't think that we have that, in mass migration into the city. But we may be able to see more new construction over time. And, I look at places like North Corktown. I see it happening. Duggan shouted out Sonia Mays of Develop Detroit. I mean, she's doing it in North End, right? Mm-hmm. Just north of East Grand Boulevard. So, I mean, we're seeing it in small pockets. But, the mayor also leaned into the fact that market values are rising for existing homes throughout the city, right? So we are beginning to see a shift. The market is looking at the city, and I say the market globally, and I mean that literally, internationally, nationally, locally, looking at the city of Detroit as a better investment than, even a couple of years ago. So we're going to see a different kind of shift where maybe it makes more sense to have new construction in places.
Now, you were talking about the issue about tearing down houses and vacant land. Let's circle back. I don't want to leave that.
Let's circle back. So the way that the narrative is often painted is, if you are an individual resident occupying a home and you live next door to a vacant house, Mayor Duggan is thinking of that resident and wants to get those homes down. And that's essentially what he said yesterday. But there seems to be very little planning about what happens after. Right? Like what happens to the vacant land after that demolition happens? And it's that lack of planning and vision, I think, that bothers me the most. It's like, well, what is the future of the neighborhood if we don't really know what happens post demolition? And I think that's where having a better single family strategy could help, which the city doesn't really have a robust one.
Well, and we need housing units.
Yes.
We definitely do.
Oh man. So I say this often, for the state of Michigan, and, if you talk to MISHDA, if you talk to, other housing experts or governmental entities in the state, we need about at least 200,000 new units in the state of Michigan, right? And about half of those are needed in the city of Detroit proper.
Wow.
So
that's a huge number.
It's a huge number. And if you add up all of the units, so it was very funny to hear, like Mayor Duggan almost got out of breath, like naming off all the unit counts for the developments that he was citing. If you add all of them up, they're only a couple thousand, right? And we need upwards of 100. So we're not making the kind of progress, and we're not developing at scale to actually meet the need.
I saw a listing for a property on the east side, and it stunned me with these beautiful aerial drone photos. And it's a great property. Like, it itself is a great property. But the 3 to 4 blocks around it were basically empty. And in my head, it is more expensive to live in the city of Detroit. I will not deny that in any way, shape, or form. Part of the benefit of living in a city is density, services, all the great things that come along with it. And for the equation to make sense, for it to be quote unquote worth it, you want to have density. Like, and when I say density, I mean like neighbors, right? And I look at it and I was stunned seeing the high price of this place, and I'm, whatever, price is the price, the market sets it. But I sat there and I'm like, I would be living, if I took this place, and I'm not interested in buying it, it's like a multifamily, but I was like, I would be living with me and my like 4 friends, and there would be nothing for 3 blocks. And like part of the magic of the city, like here in the north, and there's stuff around. There's all kinds of cool stuff around here. In fact, there's, as I mentioned on the show, there's the #1 selling liquor store in the city just a few blocks away.
Wow.
I mean,
I didn't know that.
all the things. I mean, I find all kinds of random like facts, Chase. I love the random fact. Anyway, if you're going to do these things, like I feel like there needs to be a real infill program. And the mayor seems very intent on assembling these large pieces of land for corporate development. And, they highlighted Flexengate and da-da-da. And then he did his thing from Factory Zero, which, people remember that was Detroit Hamtramck, and the whole deal with how that got commandeered is a whole podcast in itself.
I mean, he shouted out, former Mayor Coleman Young, which I thought was very interesting, and being able to clear that land, 400 acres for that project.
But what about an infill strategy? I don't think you can do this whole city with huge developers. I feel like we've got to find a way to open the door to those, smaller plots of land, or unlock them, or whatever the issue is.
So the issue again is market value and also access to financing. So the infill is difficult to do without subsidy, right? And I don't even know from a municipal standpoint whether most of that subsidy should be coming from the city, right? We really do need more of an effort from the state of Michigan and the federal government to make something like that work. But we had a one-time opportunity with the ARPA funds to do something.
That's where I was going to go.
Incredibly impactful in a very short period of time. And unfortunately, Mayor Duggan has said pretty often that he just really doesn't want this money to be used for development, or no significant portion of it.
But couldn't we use the ARPA funds or go to the foundation community and say, okay, hey, we need a rotating fund of our own to just kickstart this of $100 million, a $250 million. I don't know what the number is it's supposed to be, but couldn't we create our own fund to say, hey, you want to do a house? Here you go. Here's out the money. And as the money comes in, we lend it out to something else.
It's absolutely something that we could do.
Why don't we?
I think it's harder, and then maybe this is my cynicism. I think it's harder for an elected official to be able to point to smaller scale development as a success.
But isn't that the #1 place where he gets hit? When you saw on Twitter and you saw the responses and you saw what Council President Mary Sheffield said in interviews in the media, it was all about the neighborhoods and smaller things and da-da-da. Wouldn't that be the place where you cover your back?
You would think, but you can't point to the single family or duplex infill or 1 to 4 unit infill in a neighborhood at the state of the city and say that that's as easily and say that's a success, where you can point to.
Is that perception or reality though? Because if you're being judged by neighborhoods, wouldn't that, and who are you trying to impress with that success?
Well, so
that's the question.
He also mentioned that the same day, so yesterday, the city got a credit rating upgrade.
It did.
Right? So
press release is right here.
Yeah. So for anyone who's nerdy enough and wants to know the resource, BondLink is a really great website for governments across the United States. But you can see all sorts of press releases and data regarding a city's finances. So, if you think about the sort of institutions that the mayor also wants to market to, right? Saying that Detroit is successful, those bigger symbols is a better indicator for those institutions and for the market writ large of success. So you're right. It's a question of who is he looking to, and I don't know if he's looking to the resident, because overwhelmingly he keeps getting reelected. So do you really need to have that narrative towards the individual resident?
But don't we have like a really rich guy who runs a mortgage company who could make a lot of money writing mortgages? Like, I'm only pushing back on these things because it's all about, who are you trying to impress? It's almost like dating, right? Like, who are you trying to impress? You can't impress everybody.
It's a good question about, is Detroit a robust enough market, or is Detroit the market that Rocket Mortgage, I was about to say Quicken Loans, Rocket Mortgage wants to actually provide financing to? So it's a similar question of, for these larger institutions and markets, like what does Detroit represent, and who is Detroit?
To kind of wrap things up, what are you looking forward to in 2022 for yourself, for the city, whatever? What are your hopes for 2022? The State of the City is always a good time to take it. We are literally on the doorstep of spring. We're back in the studio, which is a great thing to be. What gives you some hope?
So for me personally, so I'm glad that one of my projects will open up this year. So I'm very happy about that. But also beginning to look at other development projects. So this will be a year of, building relationships with different neighborhoods and just really being able to finally, since we're hopefully emerging out of the pandemic, being able to show up in space with people.
Yes.
Versus having to do everything on Zoom, which I'm just very tired of doing. So that gives me great hope. But also, I think that, the state of the city aside, I think that more people are also asking about what it means for Detroiters, and specifically Black Detroiters, to thrive. And, we can talk about development all day, but development is a very limited indicator. It's actually a lagging indicator for me of like, are people actually thriving in a community? And I see a lot of philanthropic investment, nonprofit and for-profits that are really thinking through thriving. What do you need for for individuals in a community to really do well beyond just these economic indicators? So I'm heartened by that. And I think that 2022, again, will be a year of more of that kind of work.
Chase Cantrell, building community value. Thank you. It's always good to see you.
Yeah, pleasure's all mine.
If you have feedback, dailydetroit@gmail.com, or leave a voicemail, 313-789-3211. If you found what we're doing valuable, consider supporting us at buymeacoffee.com/dailydetroit, or if that's too much, leaving a 5-star review on your favorite podcast app. Until tomorrow, I'm Jer Stays. Take care of each other, and I'll see you around Detroit.